Hello, hi everyone. Okay, so we have already been talking about Salesforce admin stuff. So we have discussed about cloud computing, and now what we're going to do is we are going to talk about another very important concept, which is the MVC framework. So we discussed about what are the different apps which are available in Salesforce. How do you work with those apps? So you do have standard apps, then you have app exchange apps, and you also have the option to build your own apps using force.com platform. So that part is done, or that is something which we have discussed already. Now the next thing that we are going to discuss is about the MVC framework. Now, I spoke about this earlier. If you have to understand a complete system, and if you want to control this, if as an administrator, as a developer, if you want to understand the system, it is very important for you to understand the core framework of it. If you understand the framework, then you will be able to understand what are the building blocks, and you will be able to understand the overall system pretty nicely. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So now Salesforce application, the application that we have seen, is built on a framework which is called MVC framework. Now, while the name may sound a little, very techie kind of a thing, but it is a very, very simple framework. So MVC framework, MVC stands for Model View Controller. So there are these three letters, right? M, V, and C. So M stands for model, V stands for view, and C stands for controller. Okay. So MVC framework basically refers to a framework where your application is split into three layers. One is the model layer, one is the view layer, one is the controller layer, right? So your building blocks in the application are part of one of these three layers. All right. So now to understand MVC framework, let's not look at this for now. Just try to, understand it from a generic app understanding, or let me, try and compare it with any, generic app that you are possibly familiar with. All right. Let me take an example of something like, let's take the example of Facebook, right? So in Facebook, you get to see, if you have logged in into Facebook, you get to see some user interfaces, right? You interact through the user interfaces. There are some pages and all that stuff, right? So you start interacting with Facebook using those pages, etc., right? Now that all the components which are forming the user interface part of it fall under the view layer, so which is the V here. Okay. Now other than the user interfaces or the pages that you have, Facebook will also be storing the data in some, in some database in the server, somewhere in the backend. That is the model layer. So where all the data is stored. So all the view components are part of the view layer, and all data related stuff is part of the model layer. Okay. And all controlling logics, because it is not just the data and the user interfaces, right? It will also have a lot of controlling logics. For example, when you send a friend request, what will happen, right? A notification will go to the person who you are trying to send the friend request to, etc. So those things will happen, right? So the controller layer will have all sort of logics. What happens if you send a friend request? What happens if the friend request is accepted? What happens if the friend request is rejected? That way there will be thousands of logic which need to get executed. What happens when you open a page? What happens when you post something? Who will see it? And so there is a lot of logic. So other than the data and the UI component, there is a lot of logic. So all that logic sits in the controller layer, right? So you can say that your Facebook is also kind of built on MVC framework, and all the building blocks are part of one of these three layers. Either it will be part of the model layer, everything related to the data structure and data stored is part of the model layer. Everything related to the view components is part of the view layer, and everything related to controlling logic is part of the controller layer. Okay, so that is the thing. Now Salesforce is also built on MVC framework, right? Why understanding this framework is important? Because if you are familiar, or if you understand the framework, you will know which component is part of which layer, and you will be able to, have you control over things in a more structured manner. All right. So coming back to this, Salesforce is built on MVC framework, which means it has got 3 layers. The model layer, which contains all the database related components, okay, which includes, of course, objects like your account, opportunities, contacts, right? So we have seen the generic sales app earlier, right? So we saw that there is an option for you to store campaigns, leads, accounts, contacts, opportunities. So whatever you're storing, there is a backend database. While you are actually interacting with the front end user interface, there's a backend database where all these things are getting stored, right? So the model layer consists of all those things, all the objects, which are like database tables, and the fields on those objects, or the columns in those objects, or the database tables, right? So you would have the model layer. So Salesforce has a model layer where all data, objects, and the fields are stored. All right. In Salesforce terminology, we would refer to a database table as an object, and the columns in the database table as fields. Okay, so this is the terminology which we are going to use: object and fields. We will not be using the terminology table and column, because that's something which is not used in Salesforce. So let's continue to use what is um, used in Salesforce. So object, when I say object, I am basically referring to a database table, okay, or an entity in the data model. Okay, so of course, now we have seen the application, the sales application. Of course, in the data model, there are a lot of objects which are sitting there, like account, contact, opportunity, lead, campaign. For everything there's an object, right? All that sits in the model layer. Okay, all that is part of this model layer.